Hello, welcome back to Scripture Central. I'm Lynne Hilton Wilson.
I'm Jack Welch, and welcome. We're glad you're with us.
We're here to talk about chapters 51 to 62. These are the 7 years of the Amalekiah War. They range from the 25th year of the reign of the judges. It's been a very short period of time since Mosiah said, let's no longer have kings. And yet much of these problems over this 7-year war occur because there are people who still want to be kings. And the person who wants to be the king right now of both the Lamanites and the Nephites is Amalickiah.
And we've got a chief judge, relatively. Pahoran is now the chief judge.
Yes.
And so we have a weak state, more or less, in the central government, as we mentioned last time. So that's a motivating factor here. We want to also, as we go through this, realize that these wars are largely personal wars, that people are fighting over things that they feel very strongly about, or they're offended that they didn't get something. There are a lot of these personal motivations, even though it involves the nation and a lot of people. A lot can happen by a leader who goes in the wrong direction. And when you get someone like Amalickiah and all these A-named people, right? They're A-type people, and they're very aggressive. And I think to step back and realize what's going on here, most of the people are good people, and many of them are related.
But we have some wicked leaders who are really causing some horrific effects. I think it's interesting, not only do these names start with an A, but Amalickiah also has the MLK, which would the Hebrew word for king.
So it's going to sound kind of like Mulek and Mulekites and so on. So there's a lot of posturing and identification.
I think the names are ancient names. I think we see a lot of A names in some of the old, you've seen those charts of all the ancient names. They're fascinating to see how many of the names in the Book of Mormon we find elsewhere in the ancient texts.
Now, we've suggested a few things like using a map that you might want to just keep track of where people are, a timeline. One other thing that, we might as well mention right now is I think that a good way to get through the book of Alma is to make a biographical listing, just a list of names of the people who are involved.
The generals under Moroni, the generals under Amalickiah.
And what you'll find, and I know this is confusing, because so many of the names, like you mentioned, Lynn, begin with A. How many of them are there?
I don't know. I never counted them.
I've put down a few on my list.
Okay, let's hear it.
But it helps to keep these people straight. Of course, it begins with Alma and Amulek. And we have the city of Antionum, and then Ammoniah. We have Ammon, we have Amalekites and Ammonites and Amalickiah, and then his brother Ammorom.
And there's Antipara and Antipus.
And it goes on and on.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know why they have a dominance of beginning with A.
But it's confusing to the reader who's not familiar with them. So this has to be studied in order to really find some clarity. But it happens. You can clarify this. It's not that complicated of a story.
And it may be easier for them than it is for us. The word am in Hebrew, means the people. So that is kind of a name that you do get Ammon, the people, Mon of the people, or whatever the name might work out to be. There are good sources that you can go to study the etymology of these names, and it helps me to keep them straight, to kind of think who they are and what they're doing and what their names meant.
And one of those that I really appreciate is Hugh Nibley's work on the names. One of his great works is called Since Cumorah. This was actually used as a Sunday school manual years and years ago, and now it's available on our archive. So this is one of the great books that you can read alongside your scriptures this year to help have the text come to life.
One of the chapters in Since Cumorah is specifically about the military history. And the chapter is called The Real Background of the Book of Mormon, A Rigorous Test, Military History. And as we mentioned last time, and as many people know, Brother Nibley served throughout World War II in Army intelligence. And his job was to try to understand war and what's going on and especially to try to think what's going to happen next and to analyze the different dimensions of tactical and strategic and supply and putting it all together. So he knows what he's talking about from a real life and historical perspective. So I'm very glad, like you say, Lynne, this has not been available electronically in our archive until just recently. Many things here would help people as they read through to make good sense of what's happening here.
Let's dive into the text, chapter 51. This 25th year of the reign of the judges. It's the second Amalickiah war. It doesn't start, though, with the Lamanites. It starts with contention amongst the Nephites. And as the power struggle happens, the people who want a king come back in, and that's the first few verses of chapter 51. And then Amalickiah, who wants to be this king, has a little battle, a skirmish, fails, and we move forward.
Some of these kingmen will refuse to fight for Moroni.
Yes.
I mean, it was an obligation of every able-bodied man to serve in the military. And so for them to refuse to fight was in and of itself an act of defiance and rebellion.
We'll see that as we go through the whole chapter, because verses 3 through 7 talk about how these kingmen want to change the law. They want to vote, but unfortunately, they lose the vote. And this is written, as I mentioned, in Helaman's writing, we don't get the same chiastic structure, but he does do a nice parallel here. Verses 5 and 6. Those who were desirous of Pahoran should be dethroned from the judgment seat were called kingmen, and the law should be altered to overthrow the free government to establish a king. Then he repeats this, but in the opposite. And those desirous of Pahoran should remain as the chief judge over the land, took on the name freemen. And thus was the division among them. The freemen covenant to maintain free government. But unfortunately, as Amalickiah is coming up from the south with the Lamanites, there's these problems with the government up north. And so Moroni is trying to bring the dissenters in control. And as Jack said, they even had to have bloodshed in these verses 13 to 21.
And it does say also in verse 14 of chapter 51 that Moroni was angry.
Yes.
And
yes.
I can imagine that he would be
sounds like
quite impatient with this.
Yeah.
Remember that there had been a good period of peace and prosperity.
New cities were being built.
Economic growth and expansion. And that may be why the kingmen think, well, we don't want to go to war. We'll settle with whatever these people are. We'll give up whatever we need because it's about the economy, stupid. And let's just stay with the economic success that we've had. And Moroni says, no, it's not about the economy. It's about these values, and if we cave in, we know what's going to happen. And of course, the kingmen, once you put a king in place, there may be a good king there for a while, but then you run into the problem of a wicked king, and they knew that from King Noah and those experiences.
So while Moroni is trying to bring the people who are dissenting back in order, that's when the Lamanite army comes in and starts taking the cities.
Once again, a moment of weakness is the time to attack.
Right.
And so Amalickiah says, and of course he's been preparing as well and waiting for this, and they come with a fury. And
they come to these brand new cities. They've only been there during this 5-year period of time, right on the East Coast. He starts in Moroni and Nephihah.
And Lehi and Omner and Gid and Mulek.
Well, those go up the coast. Right. He's just on the east side. And they're the new cities. And so they don't have the same old fortifications.
They're not established. They probably don't have a lot of people.
But during one of those battles up toward the northern coast, so it's just a few days' journey up from Moroni. It says they're hot, they're exhausted, everyone crashes to sleep, and the battle stops at sunset, except for Teancum. And Teancum slips out during the night into the Lamanite territory and kills the sleeping King Amalickiah.
And he's able to get out quickly.
It says he went into the tent, so...
Yeah. Chances are they don't have walled fortification. They've set up their tent. Maybe the king only had a tent. Most people wouldn't have had tents. And so Teancum, he knows where to go. He slips in and is able to kill the king. And, there was something special about the timing of this. And because on the next morning,
That's the next
when they
chapter.
wake up, yes, it begins at chapter 52, we know that the death of Amalickiah was on the first day of the first month.
It's New Year's Day.
Now, what is special about New Year's under most ancient societies? It's whatever the New Year is, whenever it falls, it's the beginning of a new cycle, the ending of the old, the beginning of the new. And many ancient cultures actually had a year-right festival
On their New Year.
that Hugh Nibley wrote his doctoral dissertation about. They would ceremonially kill the king. So the king would not die, but the old king is put to death in a way, and then the new king rises with the new year. And so it's very important for the new king to now come forth on New Year's Day at the renewal of his reign as king.
Well, it's interesting because this is one of those exact dates we were talking about.
Right. So it must have some significance, you would think.
Definitely think it does. They found Amalickiah was dead in his own tent, and they also saw that Teancum was ready to give them battle on that day. And now when the Lamanites saw this, they were frightened, and they abandoned their design in marching to the land northward. This was very strategically.
They are ready for battle. And why aren't the Lamanites ready? Well, New Year's Day was a day of celebration. And it's so in Chinese culture.
Every culture, yeah.
And so it would be a time when you would expect them not to have gotten up early in the morning and not be prepared. And Teancum says, we're going to be right there.
Well, I think it's also significant that we can identify when this first month is because of our 10 exact dates in the Book of Mormon. One of them is the death of the Lord. And that tells us it's the first month. So we know it's in the springtime.
The first month would have been a springtime. That's right. On their calendar.
In the ancient calendar, yes. Passover, the Levitical law is very clear that Passover would be the first month, 14th day, actually. And Jesus' death is occurring at a Passover. So I have a chart here of some of these exact dates, and specifically those that deal with warfare. Alma 52, right here. 56, both in this early spring. The second month, Alma 16 and 56. We have warfare going on then in the early spring. In the sixth month, in 3rd Nephi, they describe warfare going on in now the early fall. We don't have anything between the late spring and the early fall. And then the 7th month is their fall time, Alma 56, another war. And then finally, the end of the year. And most of the battles that I've kept track of, all these battles are in the end of the year and the first part of the year.
Yeah, it's a little hard to follow when we say first and second month. Who's on whose calendar are we talking? But
well, this is the Levite. Yeah,
this is the
Law of Moses.
The Law of Moses calendar, which we think they would have been still using, because it's very important that those festivals be celebrated on the specific days when the law required them to be celebrated. And so what we do get is a gap, that there are basically the late spring and summer months. We have no warfare going on in those years, in those months. I think that's because that's when the soldiers had to be home, tending the flocks, harvesting the crops. If you don't have food.
And it's too hot, they'd faint if they're running days and days on end, it sounds like. Yeah.
And in other times of the year, it's too wet.
Yes.
And so it's interesting that is the time when we have these wars.
As the Lamanites have come around the east side of the Nephite lands, Teancum is chasing them. And Moroni is in another area where the Lamanites are on the west. And so in chapter 52, verses 1 through 19, we're now in this 26th year, and we've got armies on both the east and the west. After the death of Amalickiah, his brother, Ammorom, is made the king. And he is equally willing to fight this battle, Moroni, and they meet up. They decide to have a conference of war. And I thought this was interesting.
And Teancum has now made the town of Bountiful kind of his Alamo. He's going to make that as strong as he can, and he doesn't want the Lamanites going any farther in that direction. And so he does create now a decoy.
Yes.
Where he's going to try to get these Lamanites to be drawn out.
And it works. They're successful.
Has Lehi go one direction, and they're able to get the Lamanites out in the field so that they can engage them in open battle, because Bountiful isn't a heavily fortified town anyway.
It will be later, though.
It will be later,
not
but not
quite
yet.
yet. Not quite yet. I want to read from verses 28 to 31 here in chapter 52, because it's as I mentioned, Helaman is not the chiastic writer that his dad was, but we do see a small little chiasm here that's not as tight as some of Alma's, but it's still very good. Well, the Lamanites are weary because of their march, but Lehi's men are fresh. Moroni had been in their rear, and the Lamanites did not know it. With his army, and so all they're fearing is Lehi. But the center is that Lehi was desirous not to overtake them till they should meet Moroni's army. So we're getting the crux of their decoy. This is their strategy right here. But then, as you come out of the chiasm in verse 31, the Lamanites retreat. They're surrounded now by the Nephites, and the men of Moroni are on one hand, and before the men of Moroni were mentioned up in verse 29. And then, of course, Lehi's men are fresh again, and the Lamanites are weary because of their long march. So it's just showing us what the plan of attack was in a literary fashion.
I think there's also a little clever use of this, because Lehi is saying, we came at them from two directions. Yes. And they were in the middle. And in the chiasm, you have the two-directional language.
Good for you, Jack.
Okay, got that?
Got it.
Okay.
The bottom line is there's a lot of prisoners of war, because the Lamanites realize they cannot fight this way, and they are taken. In fact, it says there are, in verse 40, there are more prisoners of war than were slain on both sides. So the POWs become a major part of the rest of this Amalekiah war that lasts now for 5 more years as we continue on in chapter 53.
And there's a brief mention here of another Zoramite leader whose name was Jacob. And although most of the Lamanites fall back, Jacob charges again, and he is defeated in chapter 52, verse 35. So war is messy. And even though they're all falling back, and you'd think the Lamanites would all just follow the Zoramite leaders and so on, well, here's a Zoramite who thinks the Lamanites aren't being quite as aggressive and loyal as they should be, and he strikes out with whatever he can gather, and he himself is killed. So we have that little note as well. At that point, the chief captains and the Lamanites surrender. And there's an actual surrender, and that's when they're taken into captivity, and then we get the question of what to do with all these captives. Now, I would like to point out this little decoy where Lehi and Moroni figure out how they're going to, in a kind of pincer move, trap the Lamanites. We'll see this also with the
sons of Helaman in just a couple chapters. We'll be right there again.
They will be used as a decoy and other things. So the Nephites do have some tools, some military strategies worked out, and this doesn't just happen by accident. Lynne, do you think there's something we can learn from this idea of the decoy and the pincer movement?
I only know. What do you think?
Well, I think that in our life, we need to have help from other people. We divide and conquer. Just slamming up against some problem that we're facing isn't always the best way to solve our personal issues. We need friends.
Yeah. And that's why we're a ward. That's why we're churches. We're there to help each other. I love it.
Or roommates or family or whoever we are.
Well, we finally get to the place where they start fortifying Bountiful. So this is the town that will become the place where they build another temple. This is the town that's right next to the narrow neck of land. So geographically, we don't know where this is. We're not told. It's a few days' journey north of Zarahemla. But we do know that the prisoners of war are taken there.
And they are put to work.
In fact, verse 5 says, this city became an exceeding stronghold ever after.
And indeed it did. And this will be, of course, the same city of Bountiful that Jesus will appear at. Bountiful, however, had survived the destructions at the time of the death of Jesus enough that there was still a temple there.
Well, and in part because it's so well fortified.
That's right.
And it was fortified by their prisoners of war. It says they did guard the prisoners of the Lamanites, yea, even within the wall, which they had caused them to build with their own hands. Now, Moroni was compelled to cause the Lamanites to labor because it was easy to guard them while they were at labor.
Of course, the Lamanites are not armed at that point either.
Yeah. None of the prisoners of war would be armed.
Yeah, so it makes good sense.
And then in verse 6, Moroni thus gained a victory over one of the greatest of the armies of the Lamanites, and had obtained possession of the city of Mulek, which was one of the strongest holds of the Lamanites in the land of Nephi, and thus he had also built a stronghold to retain his prisoners. Although I'm fascinated in verse 7, Jack, that they take this break to feed their families, which makes me so happy. No more attempted battle in that year. Moroni employed his men in preparing for war and also delivering their women and children from famine.
Yeah, and I think this is also another indication of seasonality of
their warfare.
War.
Mm-hmm.
So although the Lamanites are being used and have their motives, the real problem comes internally.
It's tragic how many times this becomes a problem. I'll start in verse 8. They caused dissensions among them. So even though the Lamanites have gained ground over the Nephites and they had obtained these possessions, because of the iniquity among themselves, meaning among the Nephites, because of their dissensions, he says, again, he repeats the words intrigue among themselves, they were placed in a very dangerous situation.
When you think of this internal dissension, no organization, whether it's the church or a political organization or a corporation or whatever, can really succeed if they aren't mission-oriented. How can you really succeed if at home you aren't unified? And I think the world today is driving a lot of people apart. And there are controversies and dissension and arguments, and people have a hard time compromising or balancing.
We've lost the art of mediation.
Yeah, and I think that the default here, they haven't learned about mediation, I guess, very much at this point in Nephite history. But what they think is the way to get your point across is to dissent, to argue, to object, to rebel. And that's a formula for disaster on both sides.
Well, in the middle of this war, the second war, which now is being run by his brother, the poor people of Ammon, who have buried their weapons of war, realize the excruciating danger. And so these people of Ammon are considering any way that they can help.
It says that when these are the Ammonites, saw the danger and many afflictions and tribulations which the Nephites bore for them, they were moved with compassion and were desirous to take up arms. They were even willing to do that in defense of their country, even though they had sworn that they would never again let their swords be stained with blood.
So Helaman comes in, the prophet says, don't you dare break your covenant. Yeah.
And that's how important covenant keeping was.
It's been about 14 or 15 years when I went back and checked to see when they made the covenant. It's been a few years, but Helaman is just adamant. Verse 15, he says, lest by so doing they should lose their soul. I mean, he's worried about their eternal welfare, not just their physical welfare.
And so what happens?
That's when we get the enlistment of the 2,000 young, or they call them stripling warriors. Have you ever heard the word stripling before in scriptures?
Well, you told me that it does appear once, but it's in the Old Testament and referring to King David as a young man as he goes out to fight against Goliath.
They were exceedingly valiant, we're told in verse 20, for courage and strength and activity. But behold, this was not all. They were men who were true at all times in whatsoever thing they were entrusted. For they had been taught to keep the commandments of God and to walk uprightly before them. That's ending in verse 21 there.
Look at those things, though.
It's a purity code, Jack. They're just beautiful.
It's also a loyalty code.
Yes.
They were true. They were true to their covenants, and they were taught to keep the commandments and to walk uprightly before God.
And of course, they choose the prophet then to be their leader. I mean, I think you can see someone's allegiance to see who their leaders are.
At the end of chapter 55, there's an interesting little exchange where the Lamanites want to get their captives back. And of course, there's a captive exchange that is worked out, but eventually. But at first, Moroni pulls another escape kind of strategy where he waits until the Lamanites are all drunk. It reminds us of the...
Oh, but doesn't he plan the drunk? I mean, he plans the whole thing. He provides the wine through one of their little servants named Laman, who runs over and pretends he's one of them.
That's right. And then the Nephite prisoners are all freed, and the city of Gid was retaken without any bloodshed.
Now in chapter 56 to 58, this is the letter that Helaman is writing to Captain Moroni. And it covers a 3-year period of time, and it talks about these Helaman's experience with these young men. And
who do you think would have taught them?
3 times they say that they were taught by their mothers and that their faith was received then. But as you read chapter 56, verse 1, it gives us another exact date. You know, he opens the letter on the exact date, and he also opens the letter by quoting Lehi, which is fascinating to me. They call him, in verse 3, our father. I thought this was interesting, and I realized that phrase is only used for Lehi. When in the New Testament, of course, the Lord refers to his own God, Heavenly Father. But in the Book of Mormon, our father is referring to Lehi.
Here you have Alma. He is a Nephite. His son is Helaman. And he now is in charge of Lamanite boys. They come through the lineage of Laman.
Yes.
And Alma through the lineage of Nephi.
And hence he says, our father,
because
Lehi.
They have that in common.
Oh, Jack, that's perfect.
Well, it is. And I think it's a touching thing, but it's more than that. We need to seek commonality with people, to wherever the common ground is that we can find. Sometimes in conversations we might find commonality in, we served in the same mission together, or we went to the same school together, or whatever you knew, friends that you had, teachers that you had, jobs that you've had in common. Finding commonality, of course, is a good social skill.
But it just helps unify.
But more than that, in a religious sense, we are unified by our knowledge that we are children of God. He is our Heavenly Father through His Son, Jesus Christ. And in the church, through His prophet, Joseph Smith, who brought all of this together, which unifies us. So I think that little phrase, our Father Lehi, is, so often you just push a little on the Scriptures and out come a flood of interesting thoughts.
Oh, I love it. And that's why we don't just read the Scriptures, we study them. Read them slowly with a pencil in hand. And for me, the map really helps. And here in verse 9 is another one of those places. The town of Judea, which is south of Zarahemla, becomes the home base for Helaman and his 2,000 stripling warriors. And the rest of the battles this year will be coming and going from this home base. So in chapter 56, verse 30, we have this first battle that the sons of Ammon are going to have to participate in. And they choose to use the decoy again, Jack, just like you were saying before. And these young men are very strong and begin a decoy. The Elamanite army want to chase them, and they are able to outrun them. But in the middle of the decoy, they realize that the Lamanites have stopped chasing them, and there's probably a battle that's ensuing. And so Alma asks in verse 44, will you go against them to battle? And these wonderful sons call the prophet Father, which I think is so endearing. They say, Father, behold, our God is with us, and he will not suffer that we should fall. Then let us go, lest they should overpower the army of Antipas, which is the Nephite army that they had already planned to make this decoy with. And in verse 47, it reads, Now they had never fought, yet they did not fear death, and they did think more upon the liberty of their fathers than upon their lives. They had been taught by their mothers that if they did not doubt, God would deliver them. And may all of us, mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, primary teachers, and seminary teachers, instill faith in our youth that they will not doubt. But for me, so much of this battle is a miraculous timing. As we look at the end of chapter 56, starting in verse 51, so the Lamanites have killed Antipas, and they're just about to retreat right when the 2,000 stripling warriors come in. And we're told in verse 56 that they fought as if it were the strength of God. And they did frighten the Lamanites. Every one of them are injured, and every one of them are saved. And Captain Moroni receives this letter, and that's when we start chapter 57. He's still writing the letter, and Antipara has just fallen into their hands, and he receives 60 more of these young stripling men from the people of Ammon. And with this extra strength and the extra provisions, they're able to surround the city of Cumeni. So Helaman's center base is just south of Zarahemla, 2 or 3 days' journey. And that's where they're fighting. They're in a different place than Teancum. It's a different area, but they are able to do such a powerful job with the strength of the Lord and the faith of these young men that they are again able to keep conquering city by city as they go in this area.
In his letter, Helaman then says, But behold, my little band, 2,060, fought most desperately. Yea, they were firm before the Lamanites, and did administer death unto all who opposed them. And then, as the remainder of the Nephite army came up, they were able to hold out. And these youth, the young soldiers, were firm and undaunted. And why? In verse 21, it tells us that they did obey and observe to perform every word of command with exactness. Yea, even according to their faith it was done unto them, and I did remember the words which they said unto me, that their mothers had taught them.
That's the third time Helaman's repeated that in the letter.
To fulfill the word with exactness.
Isn't that what section 76 says? That we have to obey with exactness and have valiancy in our testimony of Jesus Christ?
That's right. We aren't asked to be slothful servants. And to be exact, it means to be precise. It means to be conscious of what's happening. To be responsive to needs as they arise, exactly and immediately. And what a great word that is, you want to be exact.
But it's exact in trust in God. It's exact in their faith, is what it says. That's verse 26 and 27. It's their faith that carried them through, and that's how they are all alive, is because God had promised them, and then they held to that promise.
And I think they were exact in their timing as well.
Yes.
That they were there and held out exactly to the end. So that's a great lesson we can all draw from that.
I love verse 36, where Helaman is then testifying, Helaman was filled with exceeding joy because of the goodness of God in preserving us. He had grown to love these 2,060 young men under his leadership, and he was so grateful for God's miraculous hand in healing them. But they were desperately now in need of more provisions. And chapter 58 in this letter just is begging Moroni to go figure out what's happening in the government. They aren't that far from Zarahemla. Why have the provisions stopped? He said, we can't even respond. The government's, we can't fight. We can't do anything. We're just trying to stay safe here in this little town of Judea that we've been fortifying because there's not enough provisions to stay alive.
So as their provisions are running low and their needs are great, what did they do? When you're desperate,
You fall on your knees.
You fall on your knees, you do. And sometimes it takes this before we will actually finally turn to the Lord. We have to be at our wits' end, and often we want to do as much as we can. But what they did here, they knew they were in straits that they couldn't get out of. And it says, we did pour out our souls in prayer to God, that he would strengthen us and deliver us. The Lord our God did visit us with assurances. He did speak peace to our souls, and did grant unto us great faith, and did cause that we should hope for our deliverance in him. Notice in this explanation, we begin, it's kind of a progression, a sequence here. We'll talk about the pride cycle, but there's also a faith cycle. Faith develops, and I think we see the kernel of what Moroni will eventually talk about in much more detail. But I think Helaman, first of all, recognizes that faith begins by prayer. You have to ask for faith. And secondly, you don't get an immediate answer, but you get assurances. You know that God has heard you. You know that little things start to fall in place. And then you actually will have communications of peace. You know it's going to be all right. Then after that, we are granted great faith. We had a little faith before, and like the Alma, talking about the seed that you plant and you nurture. This is Alma's son telling them how this faith works in a very interesting and beautiful sense. And with the faith, then he causes that they should have hope. Remember that faith, and with faith, you then hope for things. And hope is more than just wishful thinking.
Oh, no, it's hope in Jesus Christ. It's trusting God.
And with that hope, you then have the opportunity for deliverance.
As we continue on in the account, I appreciate Brother Nibley's commentary in his book on Since Cumorah, and I'd like to read a little portion of this. These kids introduced a new dimension into the war. They were inspired, their strange spirit, devoid of hatred and utterly free of fear or hesitation, began to frighten the seasoned Lamanite troopers who had never seen anything like it. And it's good just to use the word kids for them. Stripling warriors makes them sound a little bit older than they were, but I think these are late teens.
When the church filmed this episode over in Hawaii, they got all of the young men in our stakes there in Laie and Kahuku, and they had them actually go out into the tropical jungle for a whole day, and they said, okay, we want you to really go at it. A lot of our boys came home with wounds. I mean, beat up a little bit.
Oh, dear.
I mean, it was... they put their hearts and souls and bodies into it.
This
so
enactment.
As you watch that, it's a great production.
And I'd just like to read these three beautiful verses, 37, 40, and 41. We trust God will deliver us, notwithstanding our weakness. They're the lesser in number. They have fewer provisions. And so skipping down to verse 40, it says, they stand fast in the liberty wherein God has made them free. And they are strict to remember the Lord their God from day to day. And then he closes his epistle, and we're now caught up back to the period of history where we were before the letter began.
We usually read the story of the Stripling warriors just by talking about the initial promise that they are given and the covenant that they make and the fact that they are faithful. But they're involved in a lot of different encounters here. And they travel around and they obey, and I think to read all three of these chapters with our young men and young women is a valuable experience. And to show them that there's a lot of depth in these. It's different challenges that come up, different problems that you have to face, solutions. They even use spies at one point,
Let's stick back to the text, chapter 59.
Well, in chapter 59 and 60, these two chapters are one letter that Captain Moroni will now write back to Pahoran, who is the chief judge holding down the fort in Zarahemla.
He jumps to a lot of conclusions in this letter.
Isn't it true that sometimes we get frustrated? We think we're out there doing all the work and nobody's helping us, and we can pop a cork, you might say.
Yeah, that's exactly what happens in this letter.
He still is just not getting help from Zarahemla. Now, he doesn't realize, well, Zarahemla's got its own set of problems.
Poor Pahoran is not even in Zarahemla. He has to, so whoever takes the letter has to find him over in Gid, which is across the Sidon. Yeah, he's been kicked out of his position as the chief judge. But Pahoran doesn't get angry. That's the amazing thing about the next chapter, is Pahoran is able to receive it saying, I trust your heart was good. This is amazing to me that he could not be defensive. He didn't say, you idiot.
Pahoran has had his own set of problems there. He is the chief judge.
He's been kicked out.
That's correct. But he does know what it means to be a good administrator. And he also, I think, knows how desperate his situation is.
And he doesn't know how to act. And that's why he's so grateful for this letter, is because it says, we need to clean out the inner vessel first.
And when he talks about you clean the inner vessel first, because the outer vessel is going to be cleaned second. Pot impurity was a significant problem for ancient people.
Well, especially in the law of Moses, if it's a clay pot, it's not even clean. You have to put your water in stone pots for temple work, at least.
For temple work, that's correct. But there were ways to clean impurity, even if it was a clay pot.
So it's grown some mildew or something.
Actually, there are certain instructions that tell you that you need to begin by cleaning the inside. Because if you clean the outside first, you're then going to have to touch the outside while you clean the inside. And then you're going to contaminate the outside. And so you clean the inside, it makes sense. And you purify it with whatever process, washing, sometimes with oil. If it's certain kinds of impurity, you have to throw the pot away.
Interesting.
So they had a lot of rules about this, but when he says, I realize we need to clean the inner vessel first. We need to clean the capital city here. Then we can worry about the outside. There's a nice metaphor there that he's drawing upon that has some good logic to it, but also would have had more impact. And him saying, I'm here obeying the law, I'm doing everything I can, and I'm being kind, Moroni. And Moroni's going to say, okay, I get it. And he's sorry about it. He comes to Zarahemla quickly.
Moroni does. Yep. They both do. They both meet. And which is interesting because now Pahoran joins Moroni in the military ranks to defeat those kingmen who had been trying to take over the seat again of the government.
Yeah, and in Chapter 61, Pahoran's response, at verse 9, I love the line where he says, I am not angry. At that point, he just says in verse 15, come, I welcome you. I think that's wonderful.
And then chapter 62 begins with Moroni marching up to reinstate Pahoran. And we're also told that it's now the 30th year of the reign of the judges. And I think this constant reminder of the date goes back to what you had mentioned last week. One of the reasons why the book of Alma is organized this way is to show that the reign of the judges was able to be sustained. And this story, verses 1 through 11 of chapter 62, is a good example of that.
Yeah, and in fact, if you just look at reign of the judges, it almost goes year by year by year. Every single one, we are being told this is the reign of the judges. We're reminded of that.
As Moroni goes up to help Pahoran, he once again raises the title of liberty. And it says that thousands flock to him in verse 5. And I'm fascinated with this recruitment. In the book you were mentioning earlier, Jack, about the warfare in the Book of Mormon, yes. I found this one, a public expression of private covenant. And I thought, how many times are we recruited for either a mission or a calling or a position in our communities or at work? Continuing on, it says that the covenant of allegiance was not to a man or an office, but directly to God, whom they were personally accountable for. And this is the beauty of these war chapters, is that Moroni is fighting as a disciple of God, not seeking his own power. So the usurpers of Pachias are killed, and whosoever was found denying their freedom, it says in verse 8 and to 10, they were speedily killed. And they killed those people that would not bow down to the law of a republic or a democracy.
They do say on other occasions that they're put in prison and they're held for trial, but now things are so desperate. And this is a matter of martial law, that in some cases, when in ancient law, when the problems are so difficult, the normal civil procedure is then held in abeyance.
Yeah, and it does say, I think it was pretty clear, that if they wanted to fight against it, they were killed. But if they were willing to allow the others to come in, then they just had to wait for their court date, and then they would be tried.
That's correct.
So that it was different between actually attacking physically and saying, I was in the wrong, I will wait for my court trial. As Pahoran now joins Moroni, working together, they both go out to the east coast where the battlefield is very challenging there. And it says in verse 15, they took their march with a large body of men toward the land of Nephites, and they come along some Lamanites skirmishes. But right there, during these skirmishes, the Lamanites are willing to give up their armor. And these Lamanites choose, instead of death, to go join the people of Ammon. They want to bury their weapons of war. And this turns into a great time of peace. I think this is the best outcome. And they're just en route to a battle. And the Lamanites say, you know what? If you can give us a way out, we'd like to become people of peace.
And you can appreciate also that as Lamanites, as they join with the people of Ammon, who have been moved now to Melech, maybe some of them were cousins or relatives. All those people.
If it's only been 15 to 20 years, it's, yeah.
And so that they would be willing to go and unite with those people, and perhaps also with their covenant of treaty, throw away any further warfare.
They become people of peace. I will not fight.
That's, of course, the outcome of conflict like this that you always hope for.
So they end the POW problem that way, on that one. But they do get to Nephites, and he does have to have a battle because the Lamanites there are holding it as a strong. But with the help of God, Moroni and Pahoran and their men are able to join with Teancum's men, and they're able to retake Nephites and Lehi as they go up the east coast. And it says that they don't even have to have a battle or a loss of life because of the strength. But there's one story that is emphasized where they use some interesting techniques to regain their prisoners of war. In the nighttime, Moroni climbs up onto the wall to see where are the Lamanite armies encamped. And they're just at the opening. There are embankments everywhere else. And so through the use of ropes and some kind of a ladder, whether they're sticks or whatever they're using to climb up, the Nephite army is able to get within the walls of this city during the nighttime. And they bring in so many swords that they're able to also give swords to the people that are there. And they're able to do this all in the nighttime.
It says in verse 21 that they do use, very hastily, they set this up real quickly. So this is a blitzkrieg. And they come with strong cords and ladders. And they then are able to climb the outside of the wall. And then when they go down on the inside, verse 23, then they are let down by strong cords and ladders. So they're switching them over. So we don't know what these ladders would have looked like. And they might have been sticks that had little steps worked onto them, or they might have been ropes that they had tied circles in so that they put the knots in so they can come up and down. But once again, Moroni is making use of new technology here. He's clever.
And I think he's being inspired by God.
They win, and it's a great success for them. So in verse 27, now it came to pass that the Lamanites that were prisoners were desirous to join the people of Ammon and become a free people.
So again, we have this wonderful blessing of the prisoners of war are signing a covenant, agreeing that they will bury their weapons of war. Brother Nibley said about this very event, these very verses here, there was a new spirit in the air. Moroni's patience and humanity in dealing with the defeated was beginning to bear fruit. For instead of making prisoners of the beaten Lamanites, Moroni permitted them to settle peaceably among the people of Ammon, if they would accept this covenant. And, Moroni has been saying this now for the 7 years of this war and the previous wars as well, but they didn't apply it, and now they're applying it, and it's turning out to be able to be a blessing.
Well, that night, after this victory, Teancum, who has had success on 2 previous occasions,
At least 2.
yes, decides that this leader, Ammorom, the brother of Amalickiah,
head of the Lamanite army,
yep, has been trouble enough, and that we really have to eliminate him. Somehow we've got to take him captive. Capturing the king would be extremely difficult because he's got his guard, his elite soldiers, and Teancum is angry. It says he's really mad at this situation. And we have again this word in verse 36, came to pass that Teancum, in his anger, went forth into the camp of the Lamanites and did let himself down over the walls. He knows how to do this now. And he went forth with a cord from place to place, and he cast a javelin at the king.
But it doesn't kill him. His servants awake before he dies. It does kill him, but he screams. Right. And so the servants are able to kill Teancum.
It's interesting here, I think, that although this was beneficial, it certainly helped to settle the war. And without the leadership of Ammorom and the Zoramites, the Lamanites are now able to become much more peaceful. What I see here is Teancum trying to do the right thing, and probably for the right reason. But why does it say that he went in his anger? When you are angry, that is something that can disqualify you under the law of Moses from an inadvertent, accidental slaying. But if you are already hating the person that gets killed by an axe head flying off the axe, you cannot flee to a city of refuge. Your hate disqualifies you from that.
The chapter goes on and talks about peace and becoming people of peace. Because of the prayers of the righteous, they were spared, but many had become hardened, and skipping down a little bit, and many were softened because of their afflictions, insomuch that they did humble themselves before God. So I look at this chapter 62, verse 40, 41, as saying, don't blame your circumstances. Don't blame if something's been hard. I've been through PTSD. I've been a victim. No, you can either it can take you to your knees, or it can take you to the adversary. And may all of our trials takes us to our knees. I just so appreciate the counsel that was given to Joseph Smith in section 122. All these things will be for thy experience, or all these experiences will be for thy good. We need to use all of them to come to our knees and draw closer to our God.
Then in chapter 63, we come to the end of the book of Alma. And it is here that we have a lot of people dying.
Yeah, in fact, in 62, Helaman finishes his 3-year mission, and he dies in verse 52, we're told. Right. And it's just 16 years after his father.
And we don't know why he dies.
It says earlier that there's many diseases and during certain seasons of the year. So it's a time where he's older and he's possibly been wounded himself, and he dies.
And this must have been a natural aftermath of a war like this that had torn up the countryside, and you have had lots of wounds, infections.
And it's now 3 or 4 years later, and they have now carried their toll, possibly.
So we have Helaman die. That's the son of Alma.
And then in chapter 63,
Verse
Moroni.
3, Moroni dies. Then in verse 10, Shiblon dies. Corianton, and also verse 10, he goes to another country. So all three of Alma's sons, Helaman, Shiblon, Corianton, are gone.
Yes, but before Shiblon dies, he gets the records.
He gets the records.
So we have a little bit of his writing in chapter 63.
Helaman's on his deathbed and says, Shiblon, these are yours. Shiblon was then able to give them to Helaman's son. I'm guessing that when Helaman said, Shiblon, here, you take these records, my son Helaman is too young.
Yeah, he gives him 3 years. He has them 3 years before.
And when he's prepared, you give them to him because it should go through the firstborn son lineage, and wants to stay with that.
But the main message for me in this chapter 63 is all the migrations and missionary work. It's just amazing. It says that they count the men, 5,400 men, plus women and children. So we've got at least 10,000 people, probably far more than that migrate north. And they also go west. It's describing them as going in boats with Haggoth. And it sounds like at least 3 of these sailing trips were very successful. But it says there were many boats built. We just don't know because they didn't come back to talk about it. So they don't know where they went. But Haggoth became another. It's interesting,
it's
as you
legend.
said. Yes. And I believe that the Lord is scattering Israel at this time, and that these people who have been firm in their faith are being led to other places. And one of them was Corianton, as you mentioned. Haggoth is on one of his trips, takes Corianton, the son of Helaman.
And many of the Polynesian people can trace their ancestry back many, many generations. 30 generations is what was required in the Maori culture in order for a person to become a Maori king. Now, that's a long time, a lot of years, and they can recite. How accurate it is, we don't know, but they can recite these and share with each other and make connections based on genealogy. And we do see here in the Book of Mormon the importance of genealogy too, because this genealogy of Alma will continue on down from Helaman to his son, and Helaman's son Nephi, and then that will be the father of the Nephi who will be there to welcome the birth of Jesus in 3rd Nephi. And then there will be another Nephi, which is 4th Nephi. But looking ahead, all the way down to the end of 4th Nephi, when Mormon is finally given the records. It's the lineage of Alma, all the way, father to son, to the end of the Nephite world. So this importance of genealogy, of course, we understand the importance of genealogy for many reasons. It's also an ancient concern. Kings in antiquity needed to know who their ancestors were because they needed to compete with other claims for who will be the king or not. And it's interesting that we saw genealogies of Tongans that trace their genealogy back to Haggoth. Now I'm not sure that was there before they got the Book of Mormon, but they do tie into Haggoth there.
Well, as we conclude this wonderful week of Scripture study, we hope that it can motivate you to enter the text and to find meaning in your lives. And for me, the verse on taking the circumstances of life and helping them to soften our heart and to draw closer to Christ is the verse that means the most to me. But I hope you can find a verse that can draw you to Christ, that can draw you to becoming a better disciple as we strive to serve each other, is our prayer today. In the name of our Savior and Redeemer, Jesus Christ, amen.
Amen.